Security teams need visibility into Linux systems to detect and investigate incidents and protect against unwanted activity. Operations teams are not down with downtime, and with revenue tied to uptime, ops priorities are enterprise priorities. Which is a higher priority? Why not both? Capsulate provides flexible, production-ready infrastructure protection for Linux systems, all without a kernel module. With ops-friendly production security, Capsulate delivers monitoring, detection, and response without adding operational risk or cost. Visit securityweekly.com/capsulate today to request a demo.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I'm your host, Mike Shima, joined by John Kinsella. Do you have a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover on one of the shows? Submit your suggestions for guests by completing the form at securityweekly.com/guests. We review suggestions monthly and will reach out to you once reviewed. If you missed Security Weekly Unlocked at the end of the year, you can now access all of the content on demand, whether you registered before the live event or not. Just visit securityweekly.com/unlocked and click the button to register or log right in. And John, that brings us to 2 weeks of news. We missed a Monday last week, so we're happy to have everybody joining us and listening again. And this week, there was a bit of the familiar, but also a bit of the new. So on the familiar side, there is supply chain. Once again, is a bit painful, as I alluded to at the intro. But this was a bit of a new supply chain attack by a neat write-up by the researcher calling this dependency confusion. And one of the neat things is that I'll jump into the algorithm part that caused this, is that what this researcher discovered is that the way dependencies are resolved are a bit of a confusing or perhaps a sort of best effort algorithm that says, does this package name exist on some external source and an internal source? And if it's an internal source and external source, well, maybe I'll just go after the highest release number, version number, and just install that one. And when that happens, bad things could potentially happen to the tune of 30K bug bounties for this. So that was a bit of the teaser. I don't know, was there a particular part that stood out for you on this one?
Not really. So this popped into it popped on a bunch of our radars last week, right? And at first I'm like, okay, it's another supply chain thing, and I went back to work. But like as the week went on, it kept getting attention. I'm like, let me look closer at it. And the use case and the issue is it's real. I'm not going to sort of try to say it's not. He got some hits on some pretty big names. It made for a good clickbaity headline. And then actually, I don't know if you caught. A little bit later in the week, someone else realized that the same type of vulnerability will actually have could have consequences with container image names, Docker or Kubernetes. So there's definitely something there. I think where at least in my world, where it sort of bites a lot is when people use latest on container names or container tags instead of actually pinning a version number. So it's interesting. It's there. I mean, it seems like it's such a low-hanging fruit, at least to me, that it seems like we should be doing something, our linters or something should be catching that. So hopefully a fairly easy fix for a lot of people. But I mean, obviously the consequences of it can be quite nasty.
Yeah, and I think too that I was sort of like, wait, why isn't this just a super easy fix? Because you have a couple aspects of it in the sense of, why are known internal packages being retrieved from external sources, or even step back a second and say, why are my build systems even reaching out to external systems? Period. Maybe in the sense of, shouldn't we just block all that egress traffic so that this type of attack couldn't happen? But then I was sort of thinking as well of, well, what if we're blocking outbound access and we're limiting to a well-curated mirror, but it's also kind of hard to figure out, what if that mirror is still that internal mirror is still pulling down these external versions of our internal applications or internal packages, and there's a little bit of, I guess what I'm getting at, that there's still a lot of opportunities for mistakes, because this is definitely absolutely needs a lot of attention to detail. As much as you were pointing out latest versus pinning to specific numbers, is this an internal package and should only be pulled from internal package, et cetera?
And I think that's where it got sort of interesting to me, is sort of the thought process around this, as you mentioned it. So sort of a partial aside, I was talking about this with someone earlier today. When I did some partnership work with the Pivotal guys for Cloud Foundry back in my previous life, and what was really striking there was so you have to be a large customer to be using Cloud Foundry. I think is fairly legitimate. But what I was seeing was about 75% of those large customers, their build systems were air-gapped. So I don't know if that was because Pivotal does consulting too, so I'm not sure if that was a result of the consultants coming in with a best practice system or where that was coming from. But it was very interesting to see a really large percentage of that particular user base just air-gap that thing and just stop that from happening at all. So, at least some people are thinking about this. But where I was going to go was where I got a little excited initially about this, where I thought it might be going when I first saw the headline in the blog, is not so much what can you do with it. You're basically typo squatting, right, in a way. But if you're able to get into the Docker hubs or the PIPIs or any of these systems that are these metadata, that's where I'm going. But sort of they're that place where everyone goes to download. Imagine if you could get a capture of that, those requests. Because a lot of them are going to be requests which, somehow went outside, but it's an internal package name or an internal source name. That to me is a lot more interesting, and that's sort of where my brain sort of goes, okay, well, if you're able to get that and then actually respond to those, being able to pick up that noise and do something like that, that'd be really interesting, I think. A little more complex.
That's a little bit more complex, but definitely interesting, because one of my other, and you're that gives me a good segue to one of my other thought processes on this, was that aspect of identity. Because my first thought is, well, why can't we let's just verify the signatures on these packages? But if all we're doing is verifying that the package was signed and the signature was valid, but an external attacker, signed this internal package with their own GPG key, what have you, and I'm just saying that, yep, this was signed, the integrity is fine, that's kind of missing the point that, oh, wait, this is an internal package that actually should have been signed by my own, through a chain that goes to my own CA, or for an identity that's my own developer. So again, that idea of interesting attention to detail, and I would love to be curious, or I'd be very curious too, what you're describing there. What kind of other information leaks out to these public package repos?
Yeah, and that's what 100% agreeing with what you just said. That unfortunately is one of the problems with one of the container image signing solutions out there. I've been talking about them enough for the last year, so I'm not going to name names, but they check the signature. They don't check where that signature came from. There's no way to actually check that. So, space for improvement.
Space for improvement. Speaking of space for improvement and identity and checking, there's also, I pulled this other one. So the Great Suspender from a Chrome extension, not actually an extension that I've ever used or needed, perhaps. And I don't necessarily know that it's super popular. But what was interesting about this is that it was a free open source Chrome extension. The primary developer just threw up his hands and basically said, this is a lot of work to do for free to maintain it. And somebody wants to buy this for me, sure, I'll sell it. And so what we discovered then is this idea of, I'm going to call it like a trust laundering or an usurped trust from this particular supply chain. And let's generalize it maybe a bit more to just any package. But at one point, this Great Suspender was a trusted extension. But now the owners, under new management, got it labeled from Chrome as containing malware. So not a great look, and it's something that the only thing that changed, technically speaking, was the ownership. Obviously, the capability inside it was changing. That's what triggered Chrome to say this is malware. But pretty interesting because the package name is still the same. And so, so I think it just kind of speaks to that identity. So I don't know if you're trying to unsuspend a couple of your tabs there. If you have anything else you wanted to add, or we can roll on to the next one there.
I'm like you. I'm not a Chrome user, but I'm not an active Chrome user. But I think I mean, this has sort of been, how would I say, unfurling for a few months, right? There was first a little bit of initial chatter in the community when this initially happened, and people realized where this was going. It doesn't necessarily have to be an open source package for this to happen. I think that's probably more common since the bar is lower for acquisition, and especially when you're. I mean, and it's funny, right? Because you think about Apache Software Foundation. All their releases are very specifically software. They do not release binaries. So they will release a binary, they'll make a binary available, but the official release is the software. And that's sort of coming back to this point here, where with the official release really in the way for this plugin was something you download from Chrome, right? And maybe not, but sort of the way people think of it. So that makes it more difficult to actually control the source and what you're doing with it, because the source might be open, people might be able to get to it, but if it's going over there, you're losing a little bit of that. How would I say the package or what the output is? So, and I guess that's what people really cringe about with a lot of these closed source, to use that phrase, closed walled gardens. How do you take an open source package and put it in there without having something like this happen? And yeah, maintaining these things is it requires a lot of love. There's all of us have we want to go and do something else, but still that thing needs to be updated and kept going with new features. So as a single person, probably one of the bigger things when I look at an open source package, if I'm looking to use it, what does the maintainership look like? Is it a single person, or is it a group of people, or how are they taking community input?
Yeah, and I think that's actually a good thing to raise up, because that's a bit of a callback to, I think, an article we posted 2 weeks ago when Google was making a big point about critical open source projects and bringing more, call it governance, and more sophisticated processes behind them, meaning should we have anonymous contributors to these open source projects for meaningful code changes, meaningful being a bit subjective potentially, but how do we get multi-review sign off on those types of commits? And I think that is the broader aspect of this particular plugin, showing that on the microcosm. And I just throw out too, because we don't mention perhaps tools as much as we possibly should, but a CR Excavator from Duo is a great way just to do some analysis of Chrome extensions. So I'll throw that out there for all of you listening along and want to go get some tools and poke around at Chrome extensions yourself. But I'm going to use that to also switch to just still one more article on the attacking side. And this is an update from Microsoft, which almost exactly a year ago, they published an article about web shells. And I don't know that this particular article has too much insightful or new, but I did just want to highlight it as, once again, a nice write-up. And for those of you more on the attacking side, or just kind of curious what do post-exploitation attacks look like, here's just a nice review of some scripts. And a lot of the obfuscation of these scripts is definitely human-oriented obfuscation, meaning making it sort of a bit harder for a human to read and understand what's going on. But perhaps, not a surprise that people will take over a web, will take over a web shell with a .NET, PHP, Java, JavaScript, whatever scripting language of their choice, and try to do something nefarious.
Yeah, this was the tab I was unsuspending when you caught me on the last article, and it's a good read. I think for those of you out there who haven't had a system compromised, or you haven't seen what I'll call it malicious code, but a web shell looks like, some of the screenshots and some of the code examples in here, they bring flashbacks, right? Because if you ever see this on your system, it doesn't look like code. You're like, what the hell is that? It looks like it's either base64 encoded or something weird, and like it's just a jumble of junk. And once you recognize what yours, like, crap, someone popped in my box, there's a web shell on there. But it's sort of looking at how these guys do some of this code, because it doesn't look like code. So for those who haven't seen it, it's definitely worth a peek.
Worth a peek, and it did have some recommendations at the end. But interestingly, I kind of had a mixed reaction to the recommendations. Some of them are pretty high level. Some of them are a bit generic and not so specific to just web in general. Audit and review logs from your web servers frequently. I do think that speaks to that observability that Brandon was really focusing on in our last segment. But what's also interesting is that they talk about enable antivirus prevention on web servers, which I've seen that in kind of other security checklist kind of requirements or strong recommendations. I don't know that I would go as far as to say we need AV, other than perhaps just something as simple as like clam AV, just to see that somebody was running automated downloaders and they're finding the obvious stuff, but perhaps at least file integrity monitoring, or just seeing that there's actually a new file present or a new process name running would be just as simple and effective as AV itself.
Yeah, this I'd go as far as to say that those suggestions look outdated. I'm with you. So AV on your servers that's a bit of a religious thing. I've always been of the case, nay. But think now as we go to serverless and containers, as I was watching something recently where I was talking about. Yes, I'm watching myself occasionally, but I was watching something where I was talking previously about, do I want an IDS on all my individual containers? Hell no. It's just that same sort of concept. How do you do this in a way that scales, that actually is more, I don't want to say cloud native, but more modern, technology friendly? So I think take some of the ideas here, read it, but then think, how do I implement that with whatever it is I'm doing? And hey, maybe you still have web servers. It can't all be cutting edge, so that's okay.
That's true. But yeah, I agree. Take a look at that list of recommendations, then contextualize them for perhaps a modern environment. I think is the best thing, the nicest thing we can say there. One other quick article, just in that tie of learning about web shells. There is the completely ridiculous API, which I will give them a nod and smile to for a great project name from OWASP, just to help you understand the 10 most critical API security risks. And this is definitely a project oriented towards download, install for yourself, and run through manually. Just if we've talked about OWASP top 10 API security risks, or if we just talked about any API security risks, these are just a great way to learn by doing. So just wanted to highlight that project because it's not necessarily new, but it has been updated in the last 2 weeks or so. So even if you played with it a year or two before, give it a revisit, see what's new and different. And they do have one or two secret sauce items in there as something special to find.
Yeah, it's a fun package, fun name. It's one I want to go back and revisit myself. Actually, I think we've seen over the last few episodes, we're hearing more and more people thinking about API security. So this is a good way to go and brush up the chops a little bit.
So now I also wanted to make sure we brush up our chops and not just talk about attacks and supply chain and all the things that could go wrong, but here's an article from Let's Encrypt talking about, which is pretty much a basic engineering concepts, trying to maintain availability. And the reason this came across my Appsec radar was a couple of reasons, which I just realized saying that sentence out loud is kind of silly, but they're focusing on availability. So I do like to harp on the idea of availability as one of the important parts of that CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability is pretty critical, especially if you're dealing with certificates. And Let's Encrypt was highlighting this for their reasons of, in fact, they had a compromise that caused them to have to revoke and provision, I think, a few million, was it 2 or 3 million certificates quite a while ago. And they're positing, well, what if we actually had to do this with 200 million certs? Could we handle that? What would we do to handle that? And so I thought this was just a really good article just to kind of see what are other organizations doing from an engineering perspective, as well as this is an engineering perspective that is very consequential for the consumers of the service, especially from a security perspective, where we're thinking of cert-based identity for a lot of the services that we're trying to build.
Yeah, this is so we're obviously fans here of articles like this, of like, we had an issue here, here's how we've actually identified what was going on, we've come back and we fixed and we've made it better. I've had a system, not because of the compromise, but just because of stupidity on my part. I've had a system lose its TLS cert from Let's Encrypt that was a public system that was people getting to. So that becomes suddenly a very in modern day, sort of a painful thing, right? If suddenly your a public facing website got an expired certificate on it, people start teeth gnashing pretty quickly. But what I liked about this, right, is they go through a lot of sort of infrastructure bits, like upgrading to 25 gigabit and more memory in the databases and stuff like that you would do. But really, the core for an engineering team here, at least to me, is you acknowledge you took a time to sort of think about what's going on and you made things better. That's for a lot of people, that just getting the bandwidth to do that is really hard to come by. But I think a lot of us need to do it more often. So kudos for that and actually writing it up and giving it as an example to other people. I think that for me is the big thumbs up.
Yeah, definitely a thumbs up for that. Just that idea of transparency and sharing what you learn. Another thing that stood out to me is that a lot of what they're trying to do and a lot of what they're aiming for is actually pretty measurable. So they have some goals rather than saying, "Oh, we need to re-provision 3 million certs because of an accident." Okay, let's say we actually needed to renew 200 million certs over a 24-hour period. What if we, and I think actually maybe their number, I think they got to the point where they did this engineering and they believe they could do 150 million more certs in this 24-hour period. So those are pretty measurable. Those are actually things that are nice to move towards from an engineering perspective. So as you pointed out, they're talking about like 25 gig fiber, things like that. But they actually have a very concrete goal that they can say, did we succeed? And realistically, hopefully, fingers crossed, they don't actually have to practice this in real time because there is some type of compromise or mistake or event that causes them to do this over a 24-hour period. But they could actually test it. They could reason through and say, yep, this is what we measured and this is engineering. And so for that reason alone, too, security doesn't often have as many of those like hard metrics to be able to say, would we actually succeed in what we're trying to do? And this one actually did. So another reason I just really like to highlight that.
Yeah, preach. It's remember, we're in computer engineering and software engineering, so let's try and act like engineers occasionally and benchmark initially before we start fixing things, then go and set our goals and think about what our goals should be. What's that model look like, and then how do we get there? Like, let's act like engineers and try to not be putting out fires all the time.
Absolutely. So speaking of acting like engineers as well as talking with engineers, there's another article here about scaling Appsec, or Appsec Development, keeping it all together at scale. And one of the authors of this was Clint Gibler, he has got a great TLDR-Sec newsletter. So if you're not familiar with it, go sign up and listen to that. And of course, he's been a guest here, so a good friend of the show. What was interesting to me about this is they talked a lot about what didn't work. And what didn't work for them in trying to scale application security was reviewing all of the things, meaning like here is some threat modeling, here's some security reviews, some design reviews of all of the stories as they were describing in their JIRA, or it could be design documents, something like that. And it's one of those things that perhaps feels good to do, or maybe it seems like that's what an AppSec team should do, but maybe it's not working. So my this is where we turn. Let's put on John on the spot segment. So John, in the last week, how many stories have you done threat modeling for in your JIRA system?
It's a big fat goose egg. But yeah, that's that is actually where we're trying to get to. And I am actually building up an architecture review board with that specific purpose for the day job. But yeah, what was interesting to me was around a lot of things you talked through here. Like you said, they sound great on paper until there's an image at the top of this. It's like the first, a bunch of happy faces in different colors. All the developers who are coming down, this one person, and that sort of really sinks home in a lot of ways. It makes a lot of resonations, that the phrase my unfortunate brain is looking for. But what I liked was towards the end, and it made me double take when I first read it. This concept they have of being able to be what's the phrase they're using in here? Sorry, pausing and reading at the same time. But basically, the idea of depending on what you're trying to do or where you're trying to do it. In other words, if someone's modifying a git ignore or a code owners, you're not going to look at that the same way that you're doing these threat models and stuff like that. But there was something about the wording or just how it's displayed there. The examples he's using they're using are good enough that it very sort of it made me double check and go back and what are they talking about here? But I think it's well done. All right. There's a lot of things that you're not going to model everything the same way. You're not going to look at every line of code. But as you said, I like the examples I had up top where we tried this and it didn't work. So as I like to say to people, I want other people to learn from my mistakes and not repeat the same mistakes. So this is a good example of that.
It is a good example. And I do like how you described you're creating a architecture review board. You're not creating a every Git commit review board. And I strongly agree with the sense that architecture is where you can have impact. And architecture also isn't the thing that's changing on a weekly or monthly basis. Or at least if it is, there might be some other problems that your organization has at the moment. But a sentence that stood out for me, and I just want to preach this one, is do not give them what you want, you being the security team. And I like this phrasing because it's the idea of what's the developer experience. Like if we just say as security, well, we want you just go write secure code, just go do all of these things. But if they come back and say why, offer some value for this. And I think that's what a bit of this journey was saying. They start off with, as you pointed out, a great image of happy, smiley faces. And who doesn't want smiley faces? But do those smiley faces stay smiling when you just give them work that doesn't necessarily have value or context with what they're doing? For example, updating the code owners or the git ignore, like you pointed out, John. And this was just a nice journey of that realization of what if we get to the point where we're actually reevaluating how security is approaching this problem? And I think that to me was sort of the underlying message of this. It was a good introspection of like, oh, maybe we don't know, maybe going in we had one hypothesis, but the data or in the experience set us a different way.
And I wonder at times, and I guess it's probably not wonder, I can probably say for sure, a lot of times either here on the podcast or just in life, the examples that I and probably you give to people are, I'll talk about communication and things like that. And I'm sure a lot of people eye roll and think, oh, he's doing that fluffy manager thing. But no, there's a reason we're saying this, right? It's like those two groups need to talk. And if you don't, you'll run into a situation like this. And I think that it's a great quote, and it's sort of it's a great line. And another example it gave me of don't give people what you want, give them what they want. And people feel free to use this one. Many, many years ago, my dad decided that that my mom needed a tire air compressor for Christmas. Man, you have no idea how badly that gift went over. My mom was not the mechanical type, and she definitely wasn't looking to inflate tires on vehicles, but I guess my dad was, and I guess he thought that was a great gift to give her. Don't give your software development team an air compressor, right? It's think about what they're looking for and come back and do something that keeps everyone happy and moving forward.
Yes, definitely. If you're positioning yourself as the one who wants to be full of hot air, that's possibly not the best look. So good call, John. And I am going to say, so at the risk of becoming more fluffy manager, there was one final article in here that I put from Apple Platform Security. Now, I added this over the weekend so that I could make John try and read a 196-page PDF and quiz him on it later. But this was an article from Apple that over almost 200 pages was describing their platform security. Honestly, not that it doesn't matter what they're describing, but I wanted to focus this on how would you, sort of a thought exercise for the Appsec team or your product security team at your organization. How would you approach describing your platform or product security? And how would you be able to do it in this similar way? Because if you are a B2B SaaS, for example, there's possibly an important reason to be describing your security. So this was more of using this as a model, a reference, if you will, of describing security and doing that communication. So I wanted to highlight that rather than try to make everybody an Apple platform security expert over this particular episode.
Yeah, I'd love to read it, man. As soon as I saw it last week come out, I got excited. It has been sitting in a tab since then. I haven't, I'm looking at it now literally for the first time. Um, I like, I'm obviously an Apple fan. I like how they're doing a lot of their security stuff. Even the page that leads into downloading the PDF where they sort of talk through, seems obvious, but they're doing it, breaking it down into hardware security, system security, encryption, data protection, app security services. Even the lead into it, I sort of like the way they're doing it. But yeah, I'd love to say at really any point in the next year that I've read this 196-page paper. Is that going to happen? I don't know. We'll see. But I like the way you're coming at it from. Yeah, don't necessarily try to read it. And maybe what probably makes sense on a paper like this, I haven't done it yet, but going through the index, usually what I'll do once there's sort of some critical mass that these papers get so long, I'll try to hit and pick through them, and not even look at pretty. I'll just go with the index. So I'd probably approach this in that particular way. I thought they had a section on app security. Yeah, they do.
Yeah.
Wait, it's only 10 pages. What? Is that right?
Well, it's funny. So yeah, we'll let John's brain recover as he discovers 10 pages, only 5% of this PDF is app security. Because what I was going to say is that what stood out to me is that, like, how they broke it down with hardware, system, encryption and data protection, and services security. And to me, there are dimensions of app security all over that. Now, they did call out application security as its own beast, but I thought that was kind of a nice way to decompose the platform and talk about these particular areas rather than talk about here are the security capabilities or here is how it aligns to some NIST framework or some other type of framework. So I'm just kind of offering that up as also that skeleton index for you to, for those of you listeners out here who might want to emulate this type of documentation about your own platform. And let's see if John's brain has recovered. John, are you there?
No, it's
ground
still
control
it's
to
still,
Major John.
It's still a little bit in shock. Yeah, it's a fairly light 10 pages. That's sort of weird. It's going to make me look at the rest of the doc a little more closely. I mean, so I think they're talking about in this section the security of the application, not application security. So they're talking memory protection and non-execution bits and things like that, which are great in ASLR. We talked about the last half hour. But obviously not how we think about application security, at least on a week-to-week podcast basis. So that's sort of interesting.
So that's interesting. So yeah, so tell us, so for those of you who are willing to dive into that 200 odd pages, what are your reactions? We'd love to hear more. And especially if there's a topic that might come out of it for us to chat about more in detail, we'd love to do that because we love chatting about things.
Yeah, I need you to keep stalling a little bit longer. I have 150 more pages to read.
You're doing faster than I am. I just got through the index, and so rather than stalling, I'm just going to keep verbally coming up with more segues, and I just called myself out for having a bad segue here. But I did want to say thank you, John, for setting me up for the good segues as well as the bad. That's my fault on my side. Thank you, all of you, for listeners. Thank you for joining us here on the YouTube Live, the stream, as well as in Discord, chatting with us. And thank you for everyone who's listening to us after the fact and on your subscribing in whatever way you like to subscribe. I think I've said thank you enough, so I'll just do it one more time. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next week on Application Security Weekly.